I'm going to actually introduce her before she starts, if that's okay. I want to say a little bit about who you're about to hear from. My name is Linda Noonan. I'm the senior pastor here. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm really honored to be in worship this morning and really happy to be here in the sanctuary with Melinda and Terry, and to see all of you on the wall is really, really super special. Most of us know Leslie Hamilton as one of our many amazing church members, but I want to tell you a little bit more about her before she brings our first reading this morning. Many of you know that she's a poet and a storyteller. But what you might not know is all of the exposure she's had, her publications, her productions and performances. She's featured at numerous venues throughout the tri-state area, including the Barnes Foundation, Barnes at Lola 38, the African American Museum in Philadelphia, the Carteret Waterfront Park, numerous schools in the Philadelphia district, libraries, community-based care facilities, and bookstores. She's performed in the Philadelphia Jazz and Soul Festival and for Jazz Bridge, where she premiered Blues for Trayvon Martin. Her poetry has been published in many places, including Philly John's for Women Revisited, a poetry anthology in tribute to Nina Simone, and in Toho Journal, Resistance. Her recent poetry chapbook, a chapbook is a really beautiful, thin little volume, often hand-bound, entitled Tales of Love and Loss, Pandemic Memories, was produced through a grant from the Rosenthal Foundation. And I understand that she may have copies of this poetry chapbook still available if you reach out to her. So Leslie, thank you so much for offering yourself and your words and your heart and your gifts this morning. I introduce and bring to you Leslie Hamilton for our first reading.
Thank you, Linda. This reading that I'm going to share with you is a true privilege for me to have had the opportunity to write. It was in conjunction with a project where the thought was to take a look at how people had navigated through the pandemic, who were facing housing insecurity and food insecurity, people who had been in shelters, and the things that they had encountered. And I was welcomed into Roland's House and Gloria's Place, which are two shelters in Philadelphia, primarily focused on women who have dealt with abuse, who are dealing with housing insecurity for various reasons, including addiction and just other issues that they were handling and challenges that they were facing. And these mostly women and one young man shared with me their experiences, and I've tried to honor these and lift up their voices in this poem. So in this poem, you'll hear basically 9 different voices speaking their truth in living through the pandemic. Pandemonium. Pandemic came on stealthy feet in big, heavy-soled shoes. No, boots, not shoes. Marched into Philly in March in quiet, heavy boots, leaving indelible prints in soul's ground. First case confirmed. One became 96 in the span of 7 days. Stay at home became a way of life 6 days later. 96 cases became 2,751. Face masks became mandated style. 2,751 became 5,703, became 137 deaths. And on it went. Philadelphia, pandemic memories. Loss. How much? How much time? Time with family and with friends. How many? How many lives? How many lives lost? How many opportunities lost? How many businesses lost? How many connections gone? How many families, friends lost, sisters, favorite older brothers passed, mamas, aunts who were like mamas, still got her picture up, departed. 2 cousins, a cousin-in-law, and my best friend's grandma, gone. What did I lose during the pandemic? Sense of safety, sense of normalcy, sometimes common sense of taste and smell when the pandemic caught me. Sense of true north, not clear of what is up and down. I lost community on the outside of shelter walls, sometimes found it inside. Philadelphia, pandemic, memories. Memories of violence where sanctuary should live, one who I thought was okay, but wasn't, situations unendurable, homelessness, hopelessness, sofa surfing. This was a people's emergency. I was one of the people, striding, walking, tripping, stumbling, along Broad Street, seeking safe haven, and Filbert Street for a bus, down to Cherry Street for a placement, up 39th, to Rowan's house over by Spring Garden, to Gloria's place, finally landing in a shelter in the middle of pandemic. Though I wasn't meant for a shelter. I never should have been in a shelter. People like me aren't in shelters. People like me with children like this aren't in shelters. How am I in a shelter? I'm in a shelter. Philadelphia, pandemic, memories. So much loss, much of it bad. Though I also lost bad habits, bad friends, bad ways, and gained prosperity, peace, knowledge. I learned to stay in the house, save money, work harder. I learned to reach out when in need. I learned new crafts, how to budget. Strength grew in me, swelling my bound soul, shattering rusted chains on my empowered spirit. And with it, I broke the cycle. I broke the cycle of addiction. I broke the cycle of homelessness and stood in my strength. I lost and I found, I gave back everything and I gained in every way. Philadelphia, pandemic, memories. Settled into a worn, easy chair to ease her bones, Granny would reach into her basket, pluck out fabric squares from old clothes, stitch them with dexterity, belying resolute arthritic fingers into warmth and softness. Give love and stories of our lives back to us in quilts, still treasured now that she's flown. So yes, I lost, and yes, I found, yes, I gave back everything, and yes, I gained in every way, gathered these patches of life and loss into a basket woven of grit and longing, put it next to the bed of my own making, and channeled my inner grandmother, stitched it into a Philadelphia pandemic memories quilt. Rough ridges of hot pink corduroy livid with anger, sewn next to smooth satin lavender patches of happiness. The unbending ginger twill of frustration stitched over by optimism's soft silken peach. There, the stiff yellow patches of burlap anxiety, but here, the pliable beige strips of flannel calm and many squares of sky blue. Hope was sky blue. And my aunt's favorite was my aunt's favorite color, blue like the endless summer sky that I can rise into, floating weightless like dandelion fluff, then spinning, whirling like a helicopter seed on the updraft of hope and memories and love, so much love for my dearly departed and for myself. A multitude of colors and fabrics in this patchwork. Experiences stitched together to rejoin lives ripped apart. I look forward to the day when I can get in an RV and put all of this behind me. I'll go and travel and move and be and do, unlike I'm able to do now. I look forward to time with my son. I look forward to having my children back, all my family together. I look forward to a conquered virus, no pandemic. Putting the pandemic behind and families in front, I look forward to life. For now, I stitch everything together into a Philadelphia pandemic memories quilt and use it to cover me, to cover my inadequacies, to cover myself, to recover from the cold and the isolation, to snuggle into the warmth and the protection. Lay this quilt on the bed of what has been, not to cover it up, but to warm it up and cozy it up and look at it and see it and feel it. Feel the textures, see the colors, sense the differences. If you hold it close, you can hear the crying. If you wrap it around you, you can feel the warmth. If you rub it against your cheek, you will know what it means to be loved and held in the midst of a pandemic, even if by yourself, wrapped up in your own memories quilt. A quilt like grandma used to make, a quilt stitched together from the fabric of lives, of stories, of tales, of needs and wants and demands and voices that need to be heard, and injustice and plans fulfilled and plans not made and dreams to come, and some dreams already fulfilled, coming together, all stitched together. See, can you see? All of the blues, greens, reds, gingers, peaches, pinks, all of the pinks going into lavenders, all of the lavenders going into blues, the beautiful browns, all of the colors that go into this, all hanging together, staying together as one quilt, a Philadelphia pandemic memories quilt.
Amen. Amen. Leslie, thank you so much for that sacred text this morning. Thank you so much. We hold next to that sacred text our lectionary text for this morning. It comes from a part of the Bible known as the Apocrypha, a collection of writings that is sometimes found in the middle of some of our Bibles between what we often call the Old Testament and the New Testament. And this reading comes from the book called The Wisdom of Solomon. Wisdom is portrayed here and elsewhere in Scripture as being with or a part of God since the very, very beginning. It's also worth thinking about the role of wisdom in our lives now. Who among us is sharing their wisdom, where that wisdom lives in us, and what kind of wisdom we need to live well together. Just as a note, I'm using the pronouns that are found in the original text. So from the Wisdom of Solomon, the 10th chapter, verses 15 to 21. A holy people and blameless race wisdom delivered from a nation of oppressors. She entered the soul of the servant of the Lord and withstood dread kings and wonders and signs. She gave to holy people the reward of their labors. She guided them along a marvelous way and became shelter to them by day, speaking of shelter. And she became a starry flame to them by night. She brought them over the Red Sea and led them through deep waters, but drowned their enemies and cast them up from the depth of the sea. Therefore, the righteous plundered the ungodly. They sang hymns, O Lord, to your holy name, and praised with one accord your defending hand. For wisdom opened the mouths of those who were mute and made the tongues of infants speak clearly. A mighty tree has fallen, and the reverberations from this single tree have been felt across the entire earth. South African Anglican Archbishop Desmond Tutu died the day after Christmas at the age of 90. One of the things that has given me so much joy in this past week is seeing pictures posted by so many of my friends and colleagues of selfies that they took with Tutu, often referred to as the Arch. If you had the chance to take a selfie with almost anyone in the world, Archbishop Tutu would be a great choice. In every picture, he is grinning ear to ear. He had the most irrepressible smile, an infectious laugh. The man was the embodiment of joy, an incredible sense of humor. He had the twinklingest eyes, and holy cow, could that man dance. Time and time and time again, he would break out dancing, his purple robes swishing about his diminutive 5'5" frame. He was a giant in a small, vulnerable package. He nearly died as an infant from polio and suffered its effects his entire life, living with a weakened right hand. Because of his constant pain, he would regularly rub his hand, something that his enemies actually often exploited, suggesting that he was wringing his hands in guilt. As a teenager, he suffered tuberculosis, which left adhesions on his lungs. Later in the 1980s, when he became what Nelson Mandela called public enemy number one to the apartheid regime, he survived a number of assassination attempts. And for the last 25 years of his life, he lived with recurrent bouts of prostate cancer. He lived his life with faith, conviction, courage, and passion, but it was a life lived against the odds. Tutu was many things: a holy troublemaker. His humor and laughter resolved tense situations countless times, both in the church and in politics. He was able, unlike almost any other, to break almost any deadlock. He knew how to listen and was committed to consensus building, and he wasn't afraid to learn or to grow. He's most well known for his role in helping to end apartheid, a system of institutionalized racial segregation that kept whites, which were only 15% of the South African population, in power and control of almost every single aspect of life. It involved the creation of homelands where Black South Africans were required to reside and had to have legal papers or passbooks to even leave those areas, a system that we should note was modeled almost completely after the American Indian reservation system. Apartheid forcibly and violently removed people from vast residential areas deemed useful to the government. My own in-laws were removed at gunpoint in the 1940s and with tanks and soldiers from their ancestral home, a place that was near a river with rich, rich earth. And they were relocated, put literally into tanks and vans and trucks, and driven to a place miles away, a hard-to-reach area with little water, full of rock and weak, weak soil. Tutu was an Anglican priest, a bishop, a theologian, and a human rights activist. He, along with countless other South African clergy leaders, helped to mobilize the church around the world to put pressure on the South African government to end apartheid. And after legal apartheid ended in 1994, he chaired the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, known as the TRC, the world's most significant truth-telling project. The TRC was a court-like restorative justice body that bore witness to and recorded thousands and thousands of violations committed under apartheid. People, victims, and perpetrators faced one another, heard and told the truth. In churches, in schools, on hillsides, thousands of hearings took place. Victims and families of victims told their stories to the police, soldiers, and those who had committed the crimes in the name of white supremacy, who were forced to listen, and the whole world watched. Tutu chaired that commission and sat through thousands of these hearings, thousands of stories, adjudicating, absorbing, weeping, holding space for truth, creating openings for healing. So many people, much more wise and eloquent than I, have written about Desmond Tutu's impact on the world. And this morning I want to invite a couple of their voices into this room. Robert Jones Jr. is one. a gay black man. He's the author of the astonishing novel, The Prophets, and is also the son of Baldwin social media account. He writes about Tutu and peace. Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu was rare because he understood what peace actually means. He knew that it isn't surrender. He knew that it isn't ornamental, sentimental, or symbolic. He knew that it means an end to all violence, physical, psychological, emotional, spiritual, economic, and environmental, which means he knew that the responsibility of peace falls upon the transgressor, not the transgressed. Peace, he writes, is not synonymous with foolishness, as Archbishop, now ancestor Desmond Tutu articulates in an article he wrote in 2011. Healing is a process. How we deal with the truth after its telling defines the success of that process. And we know how truth is dealt with in the world. It is ignored, cast out, starved, killed, buried, given its opponent's name, which is why Ancestor Tutu's death deals such a devastating blow to corporeal existence. We are losing, Jones writes, our truth tellers in a time when the assault on truth is corporate technology secured on the pointy ends of mobs' pitchforks. You would think that ending white supremacy and apartheid would be a justice issue sufficient for anyone. But Tutu took on battles that others chose to ignore. He used his privilege and his access and his power and his authority to raise issues that many said had nothing to do with the ending of racialized apartheid. Among them was the issue of climate change. He started a petition that was delivered to then Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, and President Barack Obama, calling on them and on all world leaders to step up and turn the tide on climate change. Tutu wrote and said on many occasions, "The destruction of the Earth's environment is the human rights challenge of our time." But his commitments didn't end with racial and environmental justice. He was a fierce advocate for the opening of the church to women priests. And he took on other issues very few, let alone straight black male clergy, would tackle. Shortly after the end of apartheid in 1994, Tutu wrote, "If the church, after the victory over apartheid, is looking for a worthy moral crusade, then this is it: the fight against homophobia and heterosexism." Theologically, Tutu believed that every human being is created in the image of God and worthy of respect. It is this that led him and other Christians to denounce apartheid as heresy and blasphemy, meaning that apartheid was in contradiction to the most fundamental Christian teaching, and that it was an insult to God's self. Tutu then took those same ideas and turned them on to homophobia and heterosexism. He wrote that it was the ultimate blasphemy to make lesbian and gay people doubt whether they were truly children of God and whether their sexuality was part of how they were created by God. Because of Tutu and openly gay activists like Simon Nkoli, South Africa's constitution, which was adopted in 1996, included a non-discrimination clause that lists sexual orientation alongside race and other characteristics. South Africa was the first country in the world to do so, and Tutu had actively lobbied for it. A decade later, South Africa became the 6th country in the world to legalize same-sex marriage, a full 7 years before it became legal here in the United States. Robert Jones Jr. again writes, "Tutu was the first and perhaps only Christian I've ever encountered who actually took the best, most loving, and most freeing parts of the Jesus Christ myth seriously, while never denying the inherent colonial, violent, anti-black aspects of the religion and its practices. Which is to say that he knew how to subvert and divert its power for the purposes of real liberation. While just about every other Christian in the world was building their altars out of the bones of queer and trans people, Tutu proclaimed loudly that the true sin was in the oppression of LGBTQIA+ people. Putting it very clearly, Tutu once said, "I would not worship a God who is homophobic, and that is how deeply I feel about this. I would refuse to go to a homophobic heaven. No, I would say sorry. I would rather go to the other place." I was deeply moved this week when I read a reflection by my friend, Father Michael Lapsley. He's an Anglican priest from New Zealand who had been working in South Africa in the 1980s, but had become a thorn in the apartheid government's side and was exiled to Zimbabwe. I first learned about Father Michael while I was worshiping in a chapel service in the Black Ecumenical Seminary in South Africa, where I spent the year in 1990, a time when apartheid was still legal and raging. In the middle of our worship service early one morning, one of the professors ran in sobbing, sharing the news that Michael had just been bombed in his own home by the South African government, an assassination attempt on his life. A year later, Father Michael came and stayed in my home in Chicago for a week. He had survived the bombing and was still healing, but he had lost one eye and both of his hands. We spent the week alternately visiting doctors who specialized in prosthetics and going together to his speaking engagements. He had large metal hooks attached to the ends of each arm then and continues to now. Preparing for each day took a long time, and he asked me to help him in basic things like getting dressed. There were so many things that he was yet unable to do for himself as he was still healing and adjusting. We became really close. It's also possible that he is responsible for the fact that I married the person that I did. It's a story that involves a skipped speaking engagement, inviting a friend to join us for dinner, scotch for them, not for me, and the movie The Fisher King, but that's a story for another day. On Friday this week, Father Michael wrote, "This morning was a deeply moving experience for me in many respects. I had the privilege to be part of the guard of honor of cassocked clergy to receive the mortal remains of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the world's Archbishop, arriving for the last time at the People's Cathedral. As I pray that our beloved Arch rests in peace, if he is not busy telling jokes to Mandela and the passing angels, my heart is filled with grief and gratitude. After my bombing in Zimbabwe in 1990, I spent 7 months in 2 Australian hospitals. On my return to Zimbabwe, I went to see my own bishop. He looked surprised to see me. He said, 'But you are disabled now. What can you do?' When I said, 'Well, maybe I can drive a car,' the bishop looked terrified. I said, 'I think I can be more of a priest with no hands than I ever was with 2 hands.' But by sharp contrast, later Archbishop Tutu said, 'Come and work in my diocese. I have 1 priest who is blind, 1 who is deaf, and now 1 with no hands.' Wow. One bishop saw me as a liability. The Arch saw me as an asset. Both good people, but wearing different spectacles. As he did for others, I always felt he believed in me, enabling me to soar like an eagle, and always, always prayed for me." I'm in the process of getting my next tattoo. It's become something of a family tattoo in our household, and it's a Zulu proverb that reads, "Umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu." It means a person is a person because of other people. This proverb is the core of the principle that Archbishop Tutu was instrumental in promoting, the notion of Ubuntu, which means personhood. Ubuntu is the opposite of individualism. It implies mutual responsibility, collective struggle and liberation, and compassion. It became the guiding principle, Ubuntu, of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it's been written into the South African Constitution. Tutu said, "When we see others as the enemy, we risk becoming what we hate. When we oppress others, we risk and end up oppressing ourselves. All of our humanity is dependent upon recognizing the humanity in others. He also says, my humanity is bound up in yours, for we can only be human together. We are made to live in a delicate network of interdependence. In the midst of this notion of Ubuntu, personhood, and collective thriving was Tutu's faith in a God that created us in their own image, faith in the sacred worth of the most ordinary, often discounted, marginalized, or oppressed, but still strong and beautiful people. It was this faith that fueled his commitments and drove him to keep learning and advocating and risking and loving. Religion, Archbishop Tutu said, is like a knife. You can either use it to cut bread or you can stick it in someone's back. Archbishop Desmond Tutu died as he lived. In the past week, like I know many of you, have read tribute after tribute, have seen dozens and dozens of selfies and pictures and colleagues, and listened to wisdom from the Archbishop. I've had my feed filled with this wisdom and tribute. But it wasn't until I saw the picture of his plain pine casket that I actually wept for the first time. Tutu insisted that there be no ostentatious or lavish spending on the ceremony, and that he be given the cheapest available coffin with only one bouquet of carnations from his family. He also chose to be aquamated, a greener, more environmentally friendly alternative to cremation. In this process, the body is essentially dissolved in warm water, and then the clean white bones that remain are pulverized and can be buried or scattered. Just a side note, while it's a legal option for pets in Pennsylvania, it is not legal yet for people. Among some of the resistance is the Catholic Church, which has, while it deemed cremation acceptable in 1963, still formally opposes aquamation. But there is active legislation in Pennsylvania, so I'm hopeful that before too long it will be an option for all of us. Just one more way in which Archbishop Tutu modeled for us what it means to live and die in community with others and the earth, held in God. In this new year, while we, who are ourselves ancestors in training, while we live in the shadow of this now ancestor, may we be as compassionate, as fierce, as joyful, as troublesome, and as open to learning as he has been. May we grieve deeply as he did, and may we, in the midst of the pain and the brokenness and the struggle, always, always dance. I will close with these words again from Robert Jones Jr., who writes, "Dearest Ancestor Tutu, if anyone has earned their rest, it is you. If there is anyone who has left us with the tools we need to finally end harm and injustice, it is you. We need only to heed the lessons and magnify them, multiply them by additional love and truth. And in your homegoing, I am certain that the ancestors have prepared a bounty, the likes of which you have never seen. And all the compassion you have displayed during your nearly a century on this plane shall forever surround you in the endless stretch of blackness we call cosmos. May joy and laughter and dancing be yours forever and ever. Ase." This is God's good news. Amen.